I'm not who you wrote to. She died on the way here, she said. He opened the door wider. The letter had been sitting on the corner of the kitchen table for 11 days by the time the stage pulled in. I know it was 11 because I'd counted them. Not on purpose, I'd find myself standing there in the morning with my coffee going cold looking at it, and I'd think 9 days, 10 days. The way a man counts something he can't quite explain why he's counting. The envelope was worn at the corners. I'd written to the agency in St. Louis back in February when the winter was hard enough that I found myself talking to the stove. Not out loud. Just standing there looking at the iron face of it thinking, this is what it is then. 53 years old and talking to a stove. My wife Ruth had been gone 5 years. I want to say that plain because there are men who let that become a story about them, about how they suffered, and I never wanted to be that kind. She died in October on a Tuesday, quick, the way the doctor said was a mercy. I buried her under the cottonwood she'd picked herself the year before she got sick. She'd pointed at it one afternoon and said, "That one." No other words, just that one. I did not write to the agency because I'd forgotten Ruth. I want that clear too. I wrote because the ranch needed somebody, and I was the only somebody it had. I had 800 acres, 40 head, a creek that ran good 9 months of the year, and a house that had 3 rooms more than one man needed. And I had a neighbor, Clarence Aldous, who would stop by every few weeks and look around my kitchen with an expression he thought he was hiding and say something like, "Margaret's been putting up extra apple butter, said she'd send some over." Margaret was his wife. They'd been married 32 years. He wasn't subtle. So I wrote the letter. I wrote it the way I do most things, plain and without much decoration. I said I was a widower with a working ranch, no debt, good water. I said I was not a young man and I was not a soft one. I said I would treat a woman with respect and work alongside her, and she would not want for the basics. I did not say I was lonely because it felt like the wrong word. The right word was something closer to unnecessary. Like a fence post with no fence attached to it, still standing, no particular reason why. The agency wrote back in 3 weeks. A woman named Elspeth Crane from Missouri, 38 years old, had read my letter and expressed interest. She had experience with ranch work, having grown up on one. She was not fussy, the agent said. She was steady. I wrote to Elspeth Crane once, and she wrote back twice, and I wrote once more, and the last letter from her, the one that came a month before she was supposed to arrive, said she was looking forward to the journey, that she'd heard Kansas was wide. She wanted to see wide. That was what was in that envelope on my kitchen table, her letter, the one I couldn't stop counting. The stage came in at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, which I noticed, and then tried not to notice, and I was there with the wagon the way we'd arranged. I had on a clean shirt. I don't know why I'm telling you that, except it matters in a small way to what happened next. There were 4 passengers. A land speculator I recognized from town, a young couple who got off looking dazed and grateful, and a woman who stepped down last. She was not what I expected, which I suppose is always true when you've been picturing a letter. She was slight, dark-haired, wearing a gray traveling dress that had the dust of 3 states on it. She was carrying a bag that was too big for her by the way it listed when she set it down, and she did not scan the small crowd the way the others did. She looked at her feet for a moment, then she looked up and her eyes moved around until they landed on me. Maybe because I was standing apart from the crowd, maybe because I was the only one standing alone, and she walked straight toward me. I thought, there she is, Elspeth Crane from Missouri. And then she stopped 2 feet away and said, "I have to tell you something before anything else." I waited. "My name is Clara Marsh," she said. "I am not Elspeth Crane. Elspeth Crane died on the stagecoach in Missouri 3 days out, fever. It came fast." She held my eyes the whole time she said it. I was traveling with her because we'd met at the depot, and she was kind to me, and I had nowhere to go, and she thought maybe. She said maybe I could write to you and explain, and maybe you might. But then she got too sick to talk, and then she was gone, and the station agent in Dodge put me on the next stage out because I had enough for the ticket and I didn't know what else to do. I didn't know where else to go. She stopped, then she said, "I don't have any claim on you, I know that. I just didn't feel right showing up and pretending to be somebody I wasn't. So if you want me to get back on that stage, I'll get back on it." I stood there a moment. I thought about the letter on my kitchen table. 9 days, 10 days, 11. I thought about Elspeth Crane, who had wanted to see Kansas because she'd heard it was wide. I hoped she'd seen at least some of it. I looked at Clara Marsh. She had not looked away. She had the kind of eyes that have seen hard things and don't ask you to pretend otherwise. I reached down and picked up her bag. It was heavy. I took it to the wagon and put it in the back. Then I turned around and said, "You eaten today?" She said, "Not since this morning." I said, "Wagon's this way." That was the first day. I want to be honest about what those first weeks were, because I think men like to tell it one way, cleaner than it was. She slept in the room off the kitchen that had been a kind of storage room before Ruth got sick, and we'd needed it for a hired girl. I got it cleared out in a day, put a proper bed in it, a chest of drawers that had been in the barn for some reason I couldn't remember. I didn't ask her much. She didn't offer much. She was not shy exactly. She'd answer when spoken to directly without hiding, but she wasn't a woman who filled silence with words. I respected that. By the end of the first week, she was cooking breakfast before I came in from the morning checks. Not because I'd asked, just because she'd seen the rhythm of it and stepped in. I noticed she woke before dawn. I don't know how I knew that, except one morning I came through the dark kitchen and there were coals in the stove that someone had already stirred. She was probably already up and moving and had seen the light wasn't on yet in the barn and gone back to her room. Careful, not wanting to intrude. I found that I liked knowing there was someone else awake in the world at that hour. The county, naturally, had opinions. You can't have a woman move into a widower's house in 1887 without the county having opinions. Clarence Aldous stopped by about 10 days in, ostensibly about a fence line, and spent 20 minutes looking at Clara the way a man does when he's trying to figure out what category to put a thing in. Clara served him coffee and answered his questions about where she was from. And after he left, I went out to split wood for a while because I needed to do something with my hands. I did not explain to Clarence what the arrangement was. It seemed like none of his business. She was here. She was decent and hardworking, and she had not pretended to be somebody she wasn't. That was more than I could say for about half the county. What I could not have told you back then was what I thought the arrangement was. There was a man named Drost, Harvey Drost. He ran about 300 acres north of me, and he was the kind of man who didn't have much use for other people's rights unless those rights were his own. He had a foreman named Gibbs who came by one afternoon when I was out checking the creek, and Clara was alone in the yard hanging washing. What Gibbs said to her, I found out later and not from her, she didn't tell me. An older hand named Soto, who'd been working for me 6 years, saw it, and told me that night, quietly, after supper. He said Gibbs had come up close to her, and said some things about what kind of a woman takes up with a widower without a ceremony, and that maybe she'd be interested in something better arranged. She had, according to Soto, told Gibbs to get off my property. Gibbs had laughed. She had picked up the empty wash bucket and held it in a way that made Gibbs reconsider. Soto said Gibbs had left. I sat with that a while. A woman alone, and she'd stood her ground, and she hadn't come and told me about it, not to protect me from something, I think, but because she'd handled it and it was done. I went to see Drost the next morning. Drost was not a man who was used to being visited before breakfast. He came out onto his porch pulling his suspenders up and looking annoyed, and I told him plainly and quietly that if his man came onto my land again, I would not come to him about it a second time. Drost looked at me the way men like him look at men like me, weighing how serious I was, whether I was the kind who made speeches or the kind who meant what he said. I let him weigh it. He told Gibbs to stay on his own side of the line, and that was the end of it. I don't tell that story to make myself large. I tell it because of what happened when I got back. Clara was in the kitchen when I came in. She looked at me at whatever my face was doing and she asked where I'd been. I told her. Not the long version, just that I'd gone to have a word with the man Gibbs worked for, and that he wouldn't be coming back. She looked at me for a moment, then she turned back to the stove and said, "Thank you, Ben." She'd never called me by my first name before. I'd never asked her to. She'd been calling me Mr. Calver, and I'd been trying to decide if I should say something about it, and now I didn't have to. I hung my hat and washed my hands, and we sat down for breakfast, and neither of us said anything more about it. But something shifted. I can't tell you what it was exactly. There was something between us that was more than an arrangement, and we both knew it, and neither of us knew what to do with that, so for a while we did nothing. It was Soto who moved it without meaning to. He came to me in late September. We'd been 6 weeks into the whole thing by then. And he asked me a question the way he always asked things, sideways, looking at the horizon. He said, "She's staying on." I said I didn't know. He said, "She's good at this place. She knows where things go without being told." I didn't answer him. He said, "Got to be hard on her not knowing." And then he walked off to check on a fence post that probably didn't need checking, and I stood in the yard thinking about that. Hard on her not knowing. I had never once thought about it from her side. I had been so busy calculating whether this strange arrangement worked for me, whether I was doing the right thing by the county, whether I was being decent, whether I missed Ruth too much to be fair to another woman, that I had not thought about what it was to be her. A woman who'd come a long way with someone else's name, and lost the only person she'd known on the road, and talked a widower into keeping her fed out of nothing but honesty about who she was, and was now living in a house waiting to find out if that honesty was enough. I went in and found her in the garden. She was pulling the last of the late beans, the ones we'd let go too long but that would dry all right. She didn't look up when I came over. I said, "I don't want you to go." She kept pulling beans. I said, "I know that's not the same as what you came here for. I know it's not. I know I didn't offer you anything proper. And I know you had a plan of a sort that didn't work out. But if you want to stay, if this suits you, I'd like you to stay." She was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened up and she looked at me and she said, "What does staying mean?" I said I thought it probably meant getting married if she was willing, but that either way she was not leaving here without somewhere to go, that I wasn't going to put her out, that I was not that kind of man. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me at the stage depot, straight in the eyes, no flinching. She said, "I know you're not that kind of man." I knew it the first day. I said, "Well." She said, "I'd like to stay." We got married in November. Aldous was one of 2 witnesses. He cried, which I pretended not to see, and which I have never mentioned to him. I am going to tell you the rest of it in a kind of shorthand, the way you tell the middle of a life, because it's been 14 years and I don't have the voice for all of it. We had 3 good winters and 2 hard ones. We lost 7 head one spring to something nobody could explain and recovered most of it by fall. The creek flooded in 91 and took out the south fence and 2 weeks' hay, and Clara and Sodo and I rebuilt the fence ourselves because I couldn't afford extra help. Clara drove stakes better than either of us. She didn't make a thing of it. She had opinions about the house that I was not always fast to agree with, and I was not always right to resist them. There's a window in the kitchen that she wanted cut on the east wall so the morning light came in, and I said the insulation wasn't right and we'd lose heat, and she said we could fix the insulation. We cut the window. The kitchen is better with it. She learned to ride well enough to go to town alone, which she preferred. She had a small circle of women she liked, and a larger circle she politely avoided, which told me everything I needed to know about her judgment. She did not try to move Ruth's cottonwood or change what it was. She planted irises around the base of it, in the spring, without saying anything to me about what she was doing. I watched her from the barn door one morning and I did not go out. I just watched. I found out she could sing, which surprised me, not in a showy way, just sometimes in the kitchen when she thought she was alone. Old hymns mostly. She had a low voice for a woman. I'll tell you about a night in the 4th year, because it's the one I come back to when I'm trying to explain what it is we have. The first early snow of the season had come down hard and fast, and I'd been out since before dawn working a section of fence that had gone down under a dead tree. I got it done, but I got it done wrong, hurried, cold hands that weren't working right by the end, and I came back in the dark knowing it would need to be done again in the morning. I came in and sat at the kitchen table and I didn't take my coat off. I just sat. Clara looked at me from the stove. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't say anything. She put a plate down in front of me, and then she sat down across from me, and she put her hands flat on the table in a way she had just rested them there, relaxed, like she was setting something down. She said, "It'll be there tomorrow." I said, "I know that." She said, "You've done harder." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Then eat." I ate. After a while, she moved around the table, and she stood behind me with her hands on my shoulders. Not a fuss, not a production, just the weight of her hands on me. And she stayed there a minute, and it was the most I'd felt in years, like a man who still had something worth holding. That's the night I mean when I try to say it plain. Not the wedding or the first morning or the first time she called me by my name. That night, that kitchen, those hands. A good woman standing behind me while I finished my supper and knowing the fence would keep till morning. I'll close with a thing she said once that I don't think she knew I held on to. We were up late talking, I don't remember about what, and she said, somewhere in the middle of it, almost to herself, "I thought I was in trouble when I got off that stage. I thought, there is no good way this goes." I didn't say anything. She said, "But you picked up that bag." I said it was heavy. She said, "I know, that's how I knew." I have thought about that a lot over the years. A man who picks up a heavy bag without being asked, without it being his bag, without anything owed. What that tells a woman about the kind of man he is. I'm not a man who needs a lot of praise. I never have been. But there's something that goes into a man when a good woman sees him clearly. Not the version of him that makes it easy on her, not the version that requires the most forgiveness, but the actual man with the cold hands and the fence done wrong and the coffee left on the stove too long. She got off that stage with nothing but the truth about who she was and where she'd come from, and I opened the door wider. And she walked in and she stayed. 14 years ago, that was. The irises come up every spring around the cottonwood. Clara puts new ones in some years. I don't ask her how many are there now. I know she knows. This morning she came out to the barn while I was working. Not for any reason, just to stand in the door the way she does sometimes and look at whatever I'm doing. She had her coffee, I had mine. We didn't say anything. That is plenty.